You know what's fascinating? A woman may overlook a man while he's giving everything, but the moment he chooses to walk away, something shifts inside her. Suddenly, the man she thought would never leave becomes the man she can't stop thinking about. Because walking away is not abandonment, it's self-respect in motion. And women feel that energy more than anything you could ever say. A man who walks away shows he values himself more than the situation, and that single decision shifts the entire energy of the relationship. Most people stay where they feel needed, familiar, or emotionally invested, even when that space no longer honors them. But a man who can walk away chooses something far more powerful than comfort. He chooses self-respect. He chooses his identity. He chooses to protect the parts of himself he spent years building. And that choice speaks louder than any argument, explanation, or desperate attempt to prove his worth ever could. When he walks away, it isn't because he stopped caring. It's because he started caring about himself just a little more than the chaos, the disrespect, or the imbalance he was tolerating. He recognizes that staying in a situation that drains him slowly erodes who he is. It steals his confidence, his clarity, and his emotional strength. So instead of clinging to what isn't working, he chooses to step back and reclaim his sense of self. That's not weakness. That's maturity. That's emotional bravery. That's a man who understands that love should never cost him his peace. And here's the truth most people don't want to admit. Walking away takes far more courage than staying. Staying is easy because it requires no change, no boundaries, no confrontation with your deepest fears. But walking away demands discipline. It requires a man to look at his own heart and say, I deserve better than this. I deserve reciprocity. I deserve a love that doesn't ask me to shrink. That kind of self-awareness frightens people. It disrupts the patterns they've gotten comfortable in. It forces them to face the reality of their own behavior. When he walks away, he also makes one of the strongest statements a person can ever make. My presence is a privilege, not a guarantee. And that's when everything shifts. The moment he removes himself from a situation where he wasn't valued, the absence begins to speak. His silence becomes a mirror. His distance becomes a lesson. People suddenly see what they ignored. They feel what they took lightly. Because the truth is, you only notice the light when it goes out, and you only appreciate a good heart when it stops giving. A man who values himself knows that love without respect becomes pain, and attention without effort becomes manipulation. He refuses to negotiate his worth just to keep someone comfortable. He refuses to sacrifice his identity to maintain a connection that isn't honoring him. And that's why walking away is so powerful. It restores the balance that was lost. It shows that he is not emotionally desperate. He is not dependent on validation. He is capable of choosing himself even when it hurts. This decision transforms him. It elevates him. It deepens his strength, because once a man realizes he can walk away from any situation that compromises his value, he becomes impossible to control, impossible to manipulate, and impossible to diminish. He becomes a man who stands rooted in his self-worth. And that kind of man will always attract the respect he once had to beg for. His detachment highlights what she took for granted, not because he is trying to teach her a lesson, but because distance naturally exposes the truth that presence once concealed. When a man is consistently available, consistently giving, consistently showing up, it's easy for someone to fall into the comfort of assuming he always will. Human nature takes familiarity for granted. We stop noticing what is right in front of us when we believe it will never leave. But the moment he detaches, the moment he pulls his energy back, every small thing she overlooked suddenly becomes visible in sharp detail. Detachment isn't coldness, it's clarity. It's the moment he recognizes that emotional overextension is costing him more than he's receiving. Instead of arguing, explaining, or begging to be seen, he simply withdraws. His silence becomes louder than any conversation. His absence becomes more meaningful than his presence ever was. And whether she admits it or not, she feels that shift instantly. The messages that once felt optional now feel strangely quiet. The attention she once brushed off now becomes something she misses. The warmth she barely acknowledged now becomes the space she longs for, because detachment creates contrast, and contrast reveals everything. When he was emotionally invested, she may have assumed that level of care was normal. She might have believed he would always prioritize her, always choose her, always be available for her emotional needs. But once he stops pouring into someone who isn't pouring back, she realizes how much he was carrying alone. She begins to replay the moments where he showed patience, where he listened deeply, where he tried to understand her even when she dismissed him. She remembers the effort he made, the consistency he offered, the stability he created. And suddenly the things she once minimized become the things she now values. Because nothing makes you appreciate presence like facing the reality of its absence. A man's detachment also strips away the illusions. When he stops giving, she sees how much she depended on the emotional support she never acknowledged. She notices the imbalance she once ignored. She feels the void where his reassurance, loyalty, and effort used to be. Detachment removes the comfort that allowed her to overlook him. It forces her to confront the truth. He was giving more than she realized, and she was receiving more than she appreciated. This shift doesn't happen because he's punishing her. It happens because detachment creates emotional space. And emotional space brings awareness. It gives her the time to see what she was blind to when she felt secure. It reveals the energy he brought into her life. It exposes the parts of herself that were too comfortable, too complacent, or too careless. Most importantly, his detachment shows her that his love was never guaranteed. His effort was never owed. His presence was never permanent. And the moment she realizes he is no longer emotionally anchored to her, she understands the value of what she had. The stability, the loyalty, the emotional investment she once assumed would stay no matter how she acted. Walking away communicates emotional discipline, not weakness, because it shows a level of self-control and inner strength that most people never develop. Anyone can stay in a situation that hurts them. Anyone can cling out of fear, attachment, or habit. But it takes a deeply grounded, emotionally mature person to step back from something they want, something they invested in, or something they hoped would work, simply because it no longer aligns with their mental or emotional well-being. Walking away is not running from the problem. It is refusing to drown in it. Emotional discipline means knowing when effort becomes self-betrayal. It means understanding that not everything can be fixed by loving harder or giving more. So when a man chooses to walk away, it shows that he has evaluated the situation, understood the reality, and is choosing peace over emotional chaos. He is not acting out of impulse. He is not punishing the other person. He is acting from a place of self-respect and clarity. That is a level of maturity most people struggle to reach. Weakness is staying in situations that drain you just because you're afraid to be alone. Weakness is begging for someone's attention when they've already shown they don't value it. Weakness is losing yourself to keep someone else comfortable. Walking away is the exact opposite of that. It is standing firm in your worth even when your heart is involved. It is letting go of what you want in order to honor what you deserve. And that takes tremendous strength. This kind of emotional discipline creates a shift. It shows the world, and more importantly, it shows him, that he can control his emotions instead of letting them control him. When someone can walk away from disrespect, inconsistency, or emotional manipulation, they're demonstrating that their boundaries are not just words, but actions. They are proving that self-worth is not just an idea, but a lived reality. They are signaling that they will not stay where they are not respected, acknowledged, or emotionally safe. Walking away also requires the ability to detach from outcomes. Most people hold on because they fear losing the future they imagined. They stay because they're attached to the potential of what could be, even when the reality is falling apart. But when a man walks away, he is choosing truth over fantasy. He is choosing the reality of how he is being treated over the hope of how things might change. That level of acceptance, that willingness to face the truth, is emotional strength in its purest form. And here's the irony. The moment he walks away with this kind of dignity, people suddenly see him differently. They realize he cannot be controlled by emotions, guilt, or fear. They see a man who thinks clearly, feels deeply, but acts wisely. A man who can walk away is a man who will never be trapped in cycles of dysfunction. He is capable of breaking patterns, resetting standards, and protecting his inner world without apology. Walking away doesn't make him weak. It makes him powerful. It shows that his heart may be open, but it is not blind. It shows that he can love, but he will not abandon himself in the process. That is emotional discipline. That is self-mastery. And that is the kind of strength that speaks louder than anything he could ever say. He stops negotiating for love and starts protecting his peace. And that single shift changes the entire dynamic of his life. For a long time, he may have believed that love meant compromise, sacrifice, and endless patience. He may have believed that if he just explained himself better, gave more, tried harder, or loved deeper, things would finally fall into place. But eventually, he reaches a point where he understands something profound. Love that must be negotiated is love that isn't freely given. And the moment he realizes this, he stops trying to earn what should come naturally. When a man is in negotiation mode, he is constantly adjusting himself to avoid conflict, to be understood, to be chosen. He bends his boundaries, softens his expectations, and shrinks parts of himself just to keep the connection alive. But the price of that survival tactic is high. It costs him his peace, his confidence, and his emotional grounding. That's when he begins to feel drained, unseen, and undervalued. And that inner discomfort is the first whisper telling him he's losing himself in the process. When he finally listens to that voice, everything changes. He stops chasing validation. He stops trying to prove his worth through his effort. He stops accepting crumbs of affection and calling it enough. Instead, he shifts his focus inward. He begins asking different questions. Does this bring me peace? Does this connection honor my needs? Am I respected here? These questions guide him back to himself. And with that clarity, the urge to fight for someone's love weakens. He realizes that love is not a contract to negotiate. It's an energy that should flow freely from both sides. Protecting his peace becomes his priority, not out of bitterness, not out of ego, but out of self-preservation. He starts recognizing the spaces that drain him versus the spaces that feed him. He sees the emotional patterns that keep him stuck. He notices how much effort he puts in compared to what he receives. And instead of forcing things to work, he chooses to let things be. If someone cannot meet him halfway, he no longer walks the entire distance alone. This shift doesn't make him cold. It makes him wise. Peace becomes the filter through which he evaluates people, conversations, and relationships. He is no longer moved by empty words or inconsistent behavior. He is no longer flattered by attention that comes without effort. He becomes a man whose emotional boundaries are non-negotiable, and people feel that difference instantly. His energy becomes calm, centered, grounded. He becomes harder to manipulate, harder to guilt, harder to confuse. When he stops negotiating for love, he stops tolerating environments where he is the only one trying. He stops allowing others to dictate his emotional worth. He stops believing that love requires suffering. Instead, he embraces the truth that real love aligns with peace, not chaos. And once he chooses peace, his entire world shifts. His confidence grows, his intuition sharpens, his standards rise, and suddenly he becomes the man who would rather walk alone in peace than stay connected in turmoil. His silence forces her to confront her own patterns, because silence is the one thing you can't argue with, manipulate, or escape. It sits there like a mirror, reflecting back everything she didn't want to see. When he stops explaining, stops defending, stops repeating himself, and simply withdraws into silence, the entire dynamic changes. The conversations that once turned into debates no longer exist. The emotional loops she used to pull him into suddenly disappear, and that absence of noise, that calm, steady quiet, becomes impossible for her to ignore. Silence exposes truth. As long as he was talking, she could deflect, blame, justify, or minimize her behavior. She could distract herself by focusing on his reactions instead of her actions. But once he stops engaging, she loses that escape route. She is left alone with her thoughts, her choices, and the consequences of how she treated him. His silence becomes a space where her denial no longer works. She starts to examine the things she overlooked, the things she dismissed, and the things she pushed him to tolerate, because silence makes her sit with what she was previously running from. When he stops responding the way he used to, no more long explanations, no more emotional availability on demand, no more rescuing the situation, she starts to realize how much he carried. She begins to replay the moments where she was dismissive, where she invalidated his feelings, where she expected him to absorb her emotional storms without ever calming his. His silence turns into a mental rewind button, forcing her to revisit everything she brushed off. The quiet makes her ask questions she never asked before. Was I too harsh? Did I push too far? Did I take his kindness for weakness? These questions don't come from guilt. They come from awareness. Silence also takes away the power she once held. When he was emotionally reactive, she could influence his state. She could control the pace of the relationship. She could rely on his predictable responses. But now, with no reaction from him, she loses that control. She begins to see that he is not as emotionally dependent as she assumed. She realizes he is capable of stepping back, observing, and choosing peace over chaos. And that shift forces her to see her patterns with clarity for the first time. Most importantly, silence removes the comfort of his presence. She no longer has someone who instantly forgives, who reassures her, who validates her, or who cushions the impact of her actions. Without that emotional safety net, her patterns become painfully clear. She sees how often she expected him to understand her while she made little effort to understand him. She sees how often she asked him to be patient while she offered impatience. She sees how she assumed he would always be there, no matter how she acted. His silence becomes accountability. It becomes the moment she realizes that relationships don't fall apart all at once. They fade slowly through patterns we refuse to change. And now that he's silent, she finally sees her own patterns without the distraction of his voice. She sees the truth that his presence once protected her from. And that truth is what changes everything. He triggers a psychological shift because scarcity creates value, not in a manipulative way, but in a deeply human, deeply psychological way that we often underestimate. When someone is consistently available, consistently giving, consistently present, the mind naturally adjusts to that abundance. It begins to treat that presence as normal, expected, guaranteed. But the moment that presence becomes limited, the moment it disappears or pulls back, the mind reacts with urgency. It begins to crave what it once overlooked. This isn't about playing games. It's simply how human psychology works. When he steps away, he unintentionally activates a principle that governs desire. People value what they fear losing. As long as he was always there, she could subconsciously treat his attention as endless. She assumed he would respond, understand, forgive, and show up every time. She believed she had time. She believed he wasn't going anywhere. But when he withdraws, when the calls stop, the messages slow, the emotional support disappears, her mind experiences a sudden shift. The comfort she relied on turns into scarcity, and scarcity makes her reevaluate everything. This shift is not about ego. It's about awareness. She begins to notice the small moments she used to ignore. She realizes how much emotional stability he brought into her life. She sees how easy it was to lean on him because he never complained, never hesitated, never withheld his presence. Now, with that presence gone or reduced, every little thing stands out. The silence where his voice used to be, the distance where conversation once flowed, the uncertainty where reassurance used to anchor her. Scarcity forces her to confront what she took for granted. It shines a light on the emotional value he brought into her world. She begins to differentiate between who she liked having around and who she truly depended on. And in that realization, his worth increases, because now she sees him not as just another man, but as a man whose presence carried weight, depth, and emotional nourishment. This psychological shift also changes the power dynamics. When he was always available, she held the emotional upper hand. She could delay, dismiss, or detach without consequence. But now, with him gone, she feels the consequences of her actions. That internal discomfort pushes her to reflect in ways she never did before. She starts asking herself why she allowed things to reach this point. She begins questioning her behavior, her choices, her emotional patterns. She becomes more aware of how she contributed to the imbalance. Scarcity creates value because it forces the mind to confront reality, the reality that he was never obligated to stay, the reality that good men don't always wait forever, the reality that his consistency, loyalty, and emotional investment were not common. They were rare. And rare things gain value when they are no longer easily accessible. As his absence settles in, she experiences a shift from entitlement to appreciation, from assumption to awareness, from taking him for granted to realizing he was someone she should have prioritized. Because when something valuable becomes scarce, the mind stops treating it casually and starts recognizing its true worth. He becomes unforgettable because he chose respect over validation. A rare decision in a world where most people chase approval, attention, and emotional reassurance. When a man stops trying to be understood, stops begging to be chosen, and stops seeking validation from someone who never valued his presence, he rises into a version of himself that commands a different kind of memory. People forget those who bend and beg, but they never forget the one who chose dignity when validation was offered at the cost of self-respect. When he walked away from the situation, he wasn't rejecting love. He was rejecting conditions that diminished his worth. Validation feeds the ego, but respect feeds the soul. And he chose the latter. That choice is what makes him stand out in her mind long after the noise fades, because she expected him to stay. She expected him to keep trying. She expected him to continue shrinking himself just to maintain the connection. But the moment he refused to participate in that dynamic, he broke the pattern. And the person who breaks the pattern is always remembered. Choosing respect over validation means he didn't need her approval to feel worthy. He didn't need her praise to feel valuable. He didn't need her attention to feel significant. He walked away because he understood that the love he deserved would never require him to trade his dignity. That understanding makes him powerful. It gives him an aura that lingers long after he's gone. She remembers him not because he stayed, but because he had the strength to leave. She remembers him because he didn't allow his emotions to override his standards. She remembers him because he didn't chase what wasn't choosing him. She remembers him because he valued himself more than he valued temporary affection. His absence becomes heavier than his presence ever was, and that weight leaves an imprint on her mind. Most people seek validation because they're afraid of losing someone. But when he showed he wasn't afraid to lose her if respect wasn't part of the equation, he changed how she saw him. He became the man who didn't beg, didn't plead, didn't lower himself. He became the man who walked away with calmness, clarity, and confidence. That kind of exit is unforgettable because it reveals character, discipline, and strength. And here's the real reason he stays in her memory. Validation only lasts for the moment, but respect echoes long after the connection ends. She remembers the way he held himself. She remembers the boundaries he didn't fold. She remembers the way he refused to be emotionally manipulated. She remembers how he carried dignity in the midst of disappointment. Those memories replay because they challenge her. They challenge her to see where she failed to offer the same respect, where she ignored his value, where she underestimated his silence. He becomes unforgettable because he stepped out of the common and into the uncommon. He becomes unforgettable because he didn't collapse into insecurity. He becomes unforgettable because he showed her that his self-worth was not dependent on her choices. His absence speaks the truth her ego refused to listen to because silence carries a clarity that presence often hides. As long as he was around, her ego had something to argue with, something to challenge, something to push against. His presence gave her excuses, gave her distractions, gave her the illusion that nothing was really wrong. She could tell herself stories. She could justify her actions. She could minimize his hurt. She could dismiss his needs. As long as he stayed, her ego felt safe, confident, in control. But the moment he was gone, all of that collapsed. His absence became a truth she could no longer escape. Ego is loud. It always wants to feel superior, right, untouched. It convinces a person that they can say what they want, do what they want, take what they want, because the other person will still be there at the end of the day. But when he finally stepped back, when he took his energy, his presence, his effort, and his availability with him, her ego had nothing left to stand on. Suddenly, the reality she ignored stood in front of her with brutal clarity. His absence reveals what his presence couldn't. While he was there, she could pretend his love was guaranteed. She could convince herself that she could treat him however she wanted, and he would still show up. She could believe she was irreplaceable. But when he disappears from her daily life, when his messages stop coming, when his voice fades from her world, her ego is forced to sit with the truth it avoided. He was not attached to her the way she assumed. He was not dependent on her attention. He was not bound to tolerate what hurt him. And most importantly, he was a man with limits, limits she crossed without noticing. His absence is not just quiet. It is confrontational. It makes her see herself in ways she never did before. She starts to replay her words, her attitude, her dismissiveness. She begins to wonder whether she pushed too hard, took too much, offered too little. The silence becomes a canvas where all the things she refused to acknowledge start painting themselves clearly. She sees the patterns he tried to talk to her about. She sees the behaviors she denied. She sees the emotional imbalance she thought she could get away with. And now there is no argument, no debate, no ego defense to hide behind. In absence, truth becomes louder than pride. She realizes he wasn't weak for staying. He was strong for loving. She realizes he wasn't dramatic for expressing his needs. He was honest. She realizes he wasn't clingy. He was invested. These truths hit harder when he's no longer there to listen, no longer there to reassure, no longer there to fight for the connection. Now she sees what he brought into her life: the stability, the loyalty, the softness, the consistency, not because he's offering it, but because she feels the void he left behind. Her ego never expected him to leave. It never believed she could lose him. But his absence forces her to understand something she refused to accept. He gave her his time and heart, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And she lost it because she wasn't listening. When a man finally chooses to walk away, it is never about punishment. It is about awakening. His absence becomes the lesson she never expected, the mirror she avoided, and the truth she refused to hear. Every step he took back revealed what she overlooked: his value, his effort, his loyalty, his presence. His detachment showed her the weight he carried. His silence exposed the patterns she denied. His emotional discipline shattered the illusion that he would always stay no matter how she treated him. And his refusal to negotiate for love proved he was done sacrificing his peace for temporary affection. He didn't walk away because he stopped caring. He walked away because he finally cared about himself. He chose respect over validation. He chose clarity over confusion. He chose peace over emotional chaos. And that choice, that rare, powerful choice, is what makes him unforgettable. It forces her to confront not just what she lost, but why she lost it. In the end, he becomes the turning point in her story, the one she remembers long after the noise fades and the excuses dissolve, the one who showed her the difference between being wanted and being valued, the one who walked away not to hurt her but to heal himself. And in doing so, he became the quiet reminder that real love never requires you to abandon your self-worth.